All forms of violence are a quest for identity. When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You're a nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody. And so you become very violent. And so identity is always accompanied by violence. This seems paradoxical to you? That ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them violent. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed. And this, I think, has been one of the big effects of the electric age. It has deprived people really of their private identity.
So that's what this is doing to me?
Yes. Everybody tends to merge his identity with other people at the speed of light. It's called being mass man. By the way, one of the big marks of the loss of identity is nostalgia. And so revivals on all hands in every phase of life today. Revivals of clothing, of dances, of music, of shows, of everything. We live by the revival. It tells us who we are or were. Separatisms are very frequent all over the globe at the present time. Every country in the world is loaded with regionalistic, nationalistic little groups.
Turn camera.
Mark.
102, take one.
With overlap, action please. Action Orson, please.
You just do anything?
No, sorry, cut.
But I once had a conversation with a famous French philosopher who's a friend of mine, and I said to him, why the hell do you write so badly? Pourquoi tu écris si mal? And he said, look, if I wrote as clearly as you do, people in Paris wouldn't take me seriously. You know, they'd think it's childlike, it's naive. This was Michel Foucault. And he was a very smart guy and wrote a lot of very good stuff. But in general, he just wrote badly. When you heard him give a lecture in Berkeley, it was perfectly clear, just as clear as I am. So why don't you write clearly? And I said, come on, now tu te moques un peu de moi, you're making fun of me. Tell me exactly why you write so badly, because in conversation, you're just as clear as I am. And he said, en France, il faut avoir au moins 10% incompréhensible. And that translates as, in France, you got to have 10% incomprehensible. Otherwise, people won't think it's deep. They won't think you're a profound thinker. And I gave a series of lectures in Paris at the Collège de France with another very famous French philosopher as my host, Pierre Bourdieu. And I told this story to Pierre, you know, what did he think of that? And he said, it's worse than 10%, more like 20%. But in any case, there are cases where the maxima of clarity, don't be obscure and don't be ambiguous, those are systematically violated. And I think German philosophy has a lot to answer for. See, there was a time when I learned French when the slogan was, ce qui n'est pas clair n'est pas français. If it's not clear, it's not French. That has been abandoned in French philosophy, and a lot of it is very obscure.
Action please.
Ah, the French.
First, the existentialists. Unlike Heidegger, they brought Freud and Marx into play. Now, Heidegger, of course, is the beginning of modern 20th century existentialism. But the French who learned from him added some new elements. As I said, Freud and Marx. They also became world famous as literary writers in addition to being philosophers. Once the war came, the French existentialists that I've just mentioned were all active in the French resistance, and war experiences fueled their sense of existentialism.
And if you look at the history of French culture since the Second World War, it has some strange characteristics. Say, let's take the 1970s when this began to blossom. The French intellectuals
The French
were the last Stalinists, dedicated Stalinists. I mean, some of them were shaken a little by 1956, but if they weren't Stalinists, they were Maoists. I mean, I remember, I don't know if it's fair to mention names, but let's say Christopher I happened to meet in the mid-70s, flaming Maoist. And it was pretty common all the way through. the French intellectuals there's a history in France which has justification that they're somehow at the peak of cultural life. So they have to be in whatever they're doing, that's what's important. In fact, France is an extremely insular culture, always has been. Everything is in France, nothing is anywhere else. Anything that's anywhere else doesn't matter.
While existentialism may seem apolitical, the French version considered it a philosophy of engagement. For the choices of the self are revealed only in action. Action reveals the self. And in their context, radical choice was always thrust in their faces. To ignore the Nazi presence during the Nazi occupation of France, to ignore the Nazi presence, or to collaborate, or to fight, but in the case of fighting, to risk not only one's own death, but the reprisals against others. That is why Sartre wrote, quote, "We were never as free as during the German occupation," unquote.
That took a vicious hit by the late 1960s because the murderousness of Marxism had been clearly laid out as a doctrine. And that opened the door to this move by mostly French intellectuals to develop the postmodern philosophy, which has these advantages which we described, but also to use that as a screening tactic for allowing Marxism to transform into identity politics.
It's even true in fields like in the sciences. I mean, they have a rich tradition in some areas, but say, I remember about 30 years ago or so, there was an article in some science journal discussing the history of the acceptance of evolutionary theory, sort of Darwinian evolutionary theory, and as it spread around the world. And pretty much the same course, some resistance finally overcame it. By the time the article was written, it was a standard scientific doctrine everywhere, with one exception, France. A large number of the professional biologists were still pre-Darwinian. This didn't seem plausible to me, so I asked a friend who's a Nobel laureate in biology who got his education in France, in fact. I asked him, does that make any sense? And he just laughed. He said the only reason it isn't 100% true is that Jacques Monod had been in the resistance, and as a reward for his resistance service, he was granted a small laboratory, and out of that laboratory came all of the great French modern biology, Monod, Jacob, other great biologists. Was that little item? Well, this gets back to the Stalinism and Maoism of the 1970s. That suddenly collapsed. One of the things that caused it to collapse was Solzhenitsyn's Gulag. It was translated in France, big sensation. All of a sudden, everyone became a passionate anti-communist. And since it's Paris, they had to be the first ones who ever discovered it. So I remember going there and hearing from leading intellectuals things I knew when I was 10 years old, because we were reading it then, But it was all new, discovered, and they had to have something novel. Well, what do you do that's novel? I should add another feature of Paris cultural life. The French intellectuals tend to be, vedette, and they're media stars. So French intellectuals are taken very seriously. They're on the front pages of Le Monde and so on. It's probably not a good thing. But if you want to be taken seriously, you have to have something exciting to say, like a movie star, or a television figure. And it's not easy to come up with exciting new ideas. So you have to come up with crazy ideas.
Essentially, what they argue is the more the modern scientific consciousness becomes sophisticated, the more it believes in nothing. And when it believes in nothing, it is led to use other human beings as objects for any kind of pleasure. Now, the unhappy conclusion to this, and it is very unhappy if you take it seriously, the conclusion is that the enlightened self, the whole notion of the Enlightenment, the 18th century, we've talked about before, the belief that we are entering a new age where if we get rid of superstition and perhaps to some extent tradition and aristocracy and the slavery of the past, and if instead we are going to enter an era where science, the scientific rational search for truth, is going to join with enlightened leadership and individual liberty and equality, that whole Enlightenment notion, freedom and power coming together, what Adorno and Horkheimer warn is that in shedding the trappings of tradition and nature and religion, this Enlightenment self turns into the fascist self, capable of any act of subjugation of others. The implication, and they say this explicitly actually, is that while social freedom, the modern notion of the free society, liberalism, democracy, is dependent on enlightened thought, Enlightenment thought must inevitably destroy itself in a new kind of barbarism. And that was called fascism in general and Nazism in particular. Well, this was a very unhappy conclusion because what it tried to claim was that and this is why the title of Adorno and Horkheimer's text is Dialectic of Enlightenment. We've seen the word dialectic used in various places in the course, for example, in Hegel. But really all it means here is the self-undermining or self-negating of enlightenment. So their claim is there's something about the modern view of the world that emerged in the 18th century that is self-undermining. And they're saying this as fans of the Enlightenment. They're saying the Enlightenment that we, Adorno and Horkheimer, have believed in all our lives and tried to extend, it looks like there's something about it that is self-undermining and self-destructive. In other words, enlightened thought leads to fascism. That's the conclusion.
And I would say that although there is a reason for postmodernism, which is the reason we just discussed, that the landscape, the infinite landscape of interpretation problem, it's a real problem. If you look at it historically, postmodernism actually grew out of Marxism. And so what happened is that the Marxists laid out their theory about the human social environment being composed of a power struggle between the privileged and the underprivileged, right? The rich and the poor in its initial phases. And that's a story that's partially true, and it's got a lot of motive power. Like the motive power is the romantic motive power that you just described. I get to be on the side of the oppressed. I get to be a warrior for what's right. There's the resentment element, which is that son of a bitch has more than me, so let's cut him off at the knees, which manifested itself brutally in the Soviet Union.
And it has spread to intellectual circles in much of the world. In the United States, for example, it's mostly confined to comparative literature departments. So if they talk to each other in incomprehensible rhetoric, nobody cares. The place where it's been really harmful is in the third world, because third world intellectuals are badly needed in the popular movements. They can make contributions. And a lot of them are just drawn away from this. Anthropologists, sociologists, and others, they're drawn away into these arcane, in my view, mostly meaningless discourses, and are dissociated from popular struggles. And you can see the impact. I mean, I've had experiences around the third world. It's kind of unfair. Maybe I won't even talk about them, but they really indicate how the level of irrationality that grows out of this undermines the opportunities for doing something really significant and important. It is kind of like consumerism.
But existentialism claims that we are thrown into existence without an essence or definition, either from God or from nature. What does that mean? In effect, we are free to make and define ourselves in action. For Sartre, consciousness is a pure intentionality. He actually used the metaphor, it's a wind blowing toward objects. Now this sounds utterly negative, but it's that negativity which gives consciousness a freedom unique in reality. That is, for Sartre, and this is one of Sartre's most famous doctrines, we human beings are absolutely free. Nothing can determine our mental attitudes, or our consciousness except our mental attitudes and our consciousness. We are free and we get no guidance from anything outside ourselves. That is to say, if we are authentic, we get no guidance from outside ourselves. Of course, most human beings try to get guidance from everything. But from Sartre's point of view, neither God nor nature, God doesn't exist for Sartre in the first place, nature exists but is totally irrelevant to what human beings are, because we are, again, consciousness, which is totally unlike anything in nature, and human society. None of these things can tell us how to live. We must simply choose. We're utterly free. At the same time as the existentialism was growing and becoming this powerful movement, partly through the crisis of the war, at the same time and a little before, in Frankfurt, Germany, there had been a school of neo-Marxist social critics. This is now before Hitler came to power in 1933. And this school of social critics developed their own unique strain of social criticism, of a very famous kind of stew or combination of elements, based on the one hand in Hegel, on the other hand in Marx, and then also in Freud. Now, this again is a little strange, because you could argue that Freud and Marxism really shouldn't have much to do with each other. This school of thought claimed they did have much to do with each other.
About this. I think this is the solution to the postmodern conundrum, because the postmodernists, bless their hearts, so we'll give the devil his due, say, well, the problem is there's an infinite number of interpretations of a finite set of facts. And the right response to that is, uh-oh, that's true. That's true. That's not good. And that's why the postmodernists say, well, you can't agree on a canonical interpretation of a great piece of literature, because the number of potential interpretations are infinite. And so then they say, well, why should we settle on any one interpretation then? Why should we privilege one over another? And then they say, well, that's all power games. And so that...
Now, what the Frankfurt School theorists did was they integrated psychoanalysis and Hegel with their neo or Western Marxism. When we say Western Marxism, we mean a Marxism that tries to avoid Leninist party authoritarianism and sought to be compatible with Western democracy. In other words, somebody trying to be a Marxist but avoid the Gulag, avoid, in other words, the slave labor camps of Stalin, find a kind of Marxism that's compatible with Western democracy and individualism, not compatible with capitalism, but with democracy and individualism. Anyway, that's what the people called Western Marxists were trying to do, and the Frankfurt School was one of the most famous groups trying to do that.
That's why they turn to Marxism, as far as I can tell, because what happens with the postmodernists is they say, oh, there's an infinite number of interpretations. And then the human part of them goes, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next then, since there's an infinite number of choices? And the postmodernist says, well, my theory can't account for that. And then they say, well, back to Marxism. And so that's why I think there's this unholy alliance between the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists. It's because postmodernism is a dead end from the perspective of applicable wisdom. It leaves you bereft and nihilistic. And that's not good, because people can't exist without a purpose. And so they sneak the Marxism through the back door.
Dialogue. The alternative to violence is dialogue, which is a kind of encounter interface with other people and situations. So in the same way, people are cooled off by media and by situations which require dialogue rather than just self-expression. Violence is a kind of self-expression. And so that the quest for identity, the person who is struggling to find out who am I, by all sorts of maladjustments, all sorts of quarrels, all sorts of encounters, such a person is a social nuisance, of course. But the quest for identity goes along with this bumping into other people in order to find out who am I, how much power can I exert, how much identity can I discover that I possess by simply banging into other people. And so that's what I had in mind when I said that the quest for identity is always a violent quest. It's a series of adventures and encounters that create all sorts of disturbance. I suppose, I don't think you have to go very far in literature for examples of it. I suppose Don Quixote.
We're going back into the bicameral mind, which is tribal, collective, without any individual consciousness.
But it seems, Dr. McLuhan, that this tribal world is not friendly.
Oh, no. Tribal people, one of their main kinds of sport is sort of butchering each other. It's a full-time sport in tribal societies.
But I had some ideas. We got global and tribal. We were going to become...
The closer you get together, the more you like each other?
Yeah.
There's no evidence of that in any situation that we've ever heard of. That when people get close together, they get more and more savagely impatient with each other.
Well, why is that? Because of the nature of man, or
his tolerance is tested in those narrow circumstances very much. Village people aren't that much in love with each other. And the global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations.
Ah, the French.
I often think comically that if you paid sociology professors 3 times as much, the probability that they would be anti-capitalist would decline precipitously. Like, I think a lot of it's driven, because there's a lot of smart people in academia, and they're underpaid relative to their intelligence. So, and that doesn't make them happy, so they get bitter and resentful about that. And they think, well, there's these goddamn bankers who are hauling in $20 million a year, and here I am, hardly struggling, but here I am struggling comparatively, and that's the issue, because comparatively on $100,000 a year, $120,000 a year.
There is a California champagne inspired by that same French excellence.